Twój przewodnik po świecie języka angielskiego.
Dzień dobry, witam bardzo serdecznie. Tu Monika Podbielska. Dzisiaj chciałabym Wam opowiedzieć historię po angielsku. Historia będzie dotyczyła jednego z bohaterów, możemy tak powiedzieć, angielskich. Bardzo ważną ikonę, osobowość dla Anglików. Jest to osoba, która nie osiągnęła co prawda wyznaczonego sobie celu, natomiast bardzo przyczyniła się do rozwoju nauki angielskiej i do zbadania tak wielkiego kontynentu jak Antarktyda. Posłuchajcie jego historii, spróbujcie zrozumieć tekst, ale jeżeli będziecie mieć problem ze słownictwem lub z gramatyką, zapraszam do pobrania pełnego tekstu z mojej strony www.monikapodbielska.com, gdzie będziecie mogli zapoznać się z całą treścią, będziecie mogli nauczyć się słówek, spojrzeć właśnie na zdania, na budowę gramatyczną i tak przygotowani możecie ten tekst odsłuchać raz jeszcze albo tak przygotowani w ogóle go posłuchać. Pamiętajcie również, że ważne jest podczas słuchania, żeby wyłapać chociaż poszczególne słowa. To już jest bardzo, bardzo wiele. Potem można właśnie sprawdzić je w tekście i powoli, tak przygotowani, możecie już śmiało słuchać autentycznych tekstów angielskich. Zapraszam. Scott of the Antarctic. Today, I'd like to tell you about one of British heroes, or a character considered as a British hero. His status has been reflected by memorials erected across the UK. The British celebrate his achievement, and now, more than 100 years after his death, people still remember about him and his theme. Listen to the story of Sir Robert Scott. Scott was a naval officer in the Royal Navy. In 1899, he had a chance to encounter with the president of the Royal Geographical Society and thus learned of a planned Antarctic expedition, which he soon volunteered to lead. Having taken this step, his name became inseparably associated with the Antarctic, the field of work to which he remained committed during the final 12 years of his life. Soon he traveled around the United Kingdom, giving talks about Antarctica. Reaching the South Pole was not the only thing Scott wanted to do. He wanted to find out as much as he could about Antarctica. He chose a team of scientists and found many people who agreed to support him, including the British government. The expedition left for Antarctica in July 1901. They stopped several times for supplies in South Africa, in Australia, and finally in New Zealand. In every place, the scientists collected examples of plants and animals. The team spent 2 years in the frozen continent. It did some very useful scientific work, and a group led by Scott traveled far into the interior of Antarctica to a point only 750 kilometers from the South Pole itself. But during the winter, the conditions in Antarctica are terrible. It is extremely cold, so cold that it is almost impossible to survive. It is also almost always dark. However, this is the time when emperor penguin birds lay their eggs, and one of the goals of the expedition was to collect one of these eggs. Scientists wanted to examine the developing babies inside the eggs. This way, they could discover how the birds grew. 3 men made the trip and traveled for 5 terrible months. They almost died from the cold, but they were successful in finding the eggs. However, this extreme cold forced the party to turn back, and so they returned to the base a month later, ill and exhausted. In fact, the expedition had come to Antarctica with very little experience of cold climates. The explorers had to learn how to travel best over the ice and snow. They had brought dogs with them to pull the sledges, but they did not understand how to use the dogs effectively. Scott concluded that although dog sledges could be useful, the only way that men could reach the South Pole was on foot, pulling sledges containing food and tents behind them. The British government then decided that Scott's expedition in Antarctica cost them too much money, so 2 ships were sent out in 1903 to bring the explorers back to Britain. Scott returned home as a popular hero. He was promoted to take rank of captain and was invited to visit the king. He quickly decided to make a second expedition to Antarctica, and that this time he would reach the pole. It took a long time, however, to find the money for the expedition and a suitable ship, and to recruit the right people to go with him. Scott's second Antarctic expedition set out in 1910. Things did not go well. On the way to Antarctica, Scott received news that the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen was also on his way to the South Pole. Scott's ship, the Terra Nova, became stuck in the ice for 3 weeks before it could reach land. He had brought ponies and motorized sledges with him to transport men and supplies, and a few dogs. One of the motorized sledges fell into the sea, as did several of the ponies. The ponies proved not to be very useful. Some of them died, the others had to be shot. Scott was now convinced that he was right. The only way to travel to the South Pole was to walk. In November 1911, the journey south began. Over 2 months later, on the 17th of January 1912, Scott and 4 others at last reached the South Pole. Over there, they found a tent and a Norwegian flag. Amundsen had beaten them. He had reached the pole 5 weeks earlier. Scott's party were heartbroken when they turned to go back to the base 1,300 kilometers away. The weather got worse and worse, and the supplies of food ran low. Cold and hunger sapped their strength. 2 members of the party died on the journey. The remaining 3 men set up camp only 18 kilometers from a depot where the expedition had left food and other supplies for them. They got no feather, and all 3 died of cold on about the 29th of March. Next to the body of Captain Robert Scott, there was found a book with the story of how 5 brave men walked to the South Pole, and we could read there that if we had lived, I would have a story to tell. It would show the courage of my friends. They would have been an example to everyone. But in this way, Scott was wrong. They died, but people still remember them as heroes. Robert Scott remained a very popular national hero in Britain for many decades. Nowadays, experts are more critical of Scott's failings and some of the decisions he took. But his courage and the courage of his fellow explorers is beyond doubt. And why did Amundsen win the race to the pole? The main reason was that he had previously led an expedition to find a sea route through the frozen sea to the north of Canada. He had learned from the Inuit people of northern Canada that clothes made of animal skins were the only way to keep warm in very cold climates. He also learned how to use dogs to pull sledges. And all his journey to the South Pole was accomplished with dogs. Scott had been wrong to think that the only way was to walk. Zapraszam Was raz jeszcze do zapoznania się z tekstem, pobrania go z mojej strony internetowej i do usłyszenia już za tydzień. Bardzo serdecznie pozdrawiam, Monika Podbielska.